It is a Sunday morning in April in a tiny railroad town folded into the mountains of Northern California. A 14-year-old girl wakes up at her friend's house, puts on her clothes for church, and walks home. Home is the cabin next door. It is a walk of maybe 30 seconds. She has made it 100 times. But this morning, when she opens the door of cabin 28, she does not step inside. She turns around and she runs. And what she has just seen will consume her family, break a sheriff's department, empty out an entire town, and leave behind a question that 4 decades of investigators have not been able to answer. Because the most disturbing thing inside that cabin was not what was there. It was what was missing. This is the story of the Keddie cabin murders. To understand what happened in that cabin, you have to understand why the Sharp family was there at all. In the summer of 1979, a woman named Glenna Sue Sharp, everyone called her Sue, packed up her 5 children and left her husband in Connecticut. The marriage was over and Sue wanted a distance, so she chose the other side of the country. Her brother lived in Plumas County, California, high in the Sierra Nevada, and that was enough of an anchor. Sue and the kids landed first in a small trailer in the town of Quincy. But a trailer is a hard place to raise 5 children, so when a larger house opened up in the nearby settlement of Keddie, she took it. Keddie was barely a town at all. It was a cluster of about 30 rustic cabins around an old railroad resort, pine trees and creek water and mountain quiet. Rent was cheap, neighbors were close, and for a single mother starting over, it looked like safety. The house was cabin 28. By the spring of 1981, Sue was 36 years old. Her oldest son, John, was 15. Sheila was 14. Tina was 12. Rick was 10 and little Greg was 5. They were not wealthy and they were not connected, but they were settled. And in a place like Keddie, everyone knew everyone. The family next door in cabin 26 was the Smart family. Marilyn, her husband Martin, and her 2 boys. One of those boys, 12-year-old Justin, was friends with the Sharp kids and slept over all the time. That closeness mattered because by that April the house next door was coming apart. Marilyn's marriage to Martin Smart was falling and she wanted out. And according to later accounts, Sue Sharp knew it, and Sue was in her corner. Remember that. Because everything that happened next may have grown from that one ordinary fact. So on Saturday, April 11th, 1981, it was an unremarkable day. Sue spent part of it with friends and came home in the evening. 14-year-old Sheila was invited to sleep over with the family next door. Not the Smarts, but neighbors on the other side. So Sheila left, which is the only reason she is alive today. That left Sue at home with Tina, Rick, and Greg, and Justin Smart, who was staying the night. The 3 younger boys settled into a bedroom. Meanwhile, 15-year-old John was in Quincy with his best friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The 2 boys spent the evening in town and sometime late that night they caught a ride back to Keddie. For decades, nobody knew who drove them. So hold on to that detail too. The boys got home, and at some point after that, someone else was inside cabin 28. What happened in the front room of that cabin took time. Investigators would later conclude it was not fast, and it was not quiet, and it almost certainly involved more than one attacker. Sue, John, and Dana were bound with medical tape and electrical wire. They were attacked with a claw hammer and with knives, one blow so violent that a knife was bent out of shape. By the time it was over, all three were dead. And then the killers did something that investigators still struggle to explain. They left. They left the weapons at the scene. They left the house standing, the doors closed, and the night silent. And in the back bedroom, three little boys, Rick, Greg, and Justin, slept on, untouched. So whoever did this walked past a room full of children and chose to leave them alive, but not all of them. Because when the sun came up, one member of the household was gone. Just after 7 in the morning, Sheila Sharp walked back from the sleepover to get ready for church. She opened the door of her home and saw what was left of the front room. She saw her mother. She saw her brother John and his friend Dana. She ran back to the neighbors, and the neighbors called for help. And then came a moment of almost unbearable tension because the boys were still inside. Through a bedroom window, the adults could see Rick, Greg, and Justin in the back room. The children were helped out through that window, dazed and unharmed, having apparently slept through the deaths of 3 people a few feet away. But when the deputies counted heads, the number came up short. 12-year-old Tina Sharp was not in the house, not in the bedrooms, not in the woods behind the cabin, not anywhere. 3 people were dead, 3 children were untouched, and 1 child had simply vanished into the mountain night. Therefore, this was no longer just a murder scene. It was a kidnapping with a clock running. Search parties combed the canyons around Keddie and found nothing. So days became weeks, and weeks became months, and Tina Sharp was never found. Not that spring, and not for 3 more years. A triple murder with a missing child should have brought overwhelming force down on a town of a few dozen people. But instead, the investigation began to fall apart almost immediately. The crime scene was small and full of physical evidence, tape, weapons, blood, but it was processed in ways that modern investigators describe as disastrous. People moved through the cabin who should never have been inside it. And then there was the question of witnesses. Justin Smart, the 12-year-old who had slept over, began telling investigators what he had seen. The problem was that his story kept changing. In some versions, he had been dreaming. In other versions, he described watching the attack itself. 2 men, one of them with the details that sounded uncomfortably specific. Sketches were drawn from his descriptions and released to the public, but they led nowhere. But investigators did have suspects, and they were not strangers. Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, the man from Cabin 26, the husband Marlene wanted to leave, had spent that evening at a bar with a friend of his, a man named John who went by Bo Bobede. Bobede was not just some drifter. He was a recent arrival with a criminal past, staying with the Smarts. And in the days after the murders, Martin Smart did something strange. He told police that his claw hammer had gone missing. A hammer, the same category of weapon used in the cabin, and he volunteered that his was gone. So you might expect that Martin Smart became the center of the case, but that is not what happened. Smart was questioned and given a polygraph, and investigators at the time said he passed. And then, according to statements made years later by people close to the case, the suspects were allowed, some say encouraged, to simply leave town. The sheriff who presided over those early months resigned from office within the year, and the case went quiet. A family had been slaughtered, a child was missing, and the file just sat there. But the story was not over, because in 1984, a man walking through the woods in a neighboring county, dozens of miles from Keddie, bent down to collect bottles and found part of a human skull. Forensic examination confirmed what everyone in Plumas County already feared. It was Tina Sharp. The little girl taken from cabin 28 had been carried far away and she had not survived. And with that discovery came a detail so strange it changed the entire complexion of the case. Around that time, the sheriff's office in that county received an anonymous phone call. A voice asked whether anyone had thought to connect the remains to the murders up in Keddie to the 12-year-old girl who was never found. That call was recorded, and according to later reporting, the tape of that call was then sealed inside the case files, where it sat, essentially untouched, for decades. So someone out there had known exactly where to point investigators, and the pointing finger was filed away in a box. Now, for most cold cases, that would be the end. But Keddie was different, because one of the local kids who grew up in the shadow of the murders never let it go. His name was Greg Hagwood. He had gone to school with John Sharp, and as a boy he had even spent nights in cabin 28, back before the Sharps lived there. So Hagwood became a deputy, and then he became the sheriff of Plumas County. So the case landed decades later in the hands of a man who took it personally. In 2013, Hagwood reopened the investigation and brought in a special investigator named Mike Gamberg, another man with his own history with the original case. And what they found stunned them. Evidence that should have been exhausted decades earlier had never been fully examined. In 2016, a hammer was pulled from a pond near Keddie, a hammer consistent with the one Martin Smart had reported missing 35 years earlier. And there was more. Investigators revealed that Martin Smart had allegedly made statements before his death, including, by some accounts, words to a therapist and a letter to his estranged wife that read to many people like a confession to his role in what happened to Sue Sharp. Smart died in 2000. Bobidi died even earlier. So if the case had ended with those two men, it would be a tragedy with a shape. Suspects identified too late. Justice missed by inches. But then came the detail that keeps this case open today. A strip of medical tape recovered from the floor near Sue Sharp's body in 1981 was tested for DNA, and it came back with a profile. And according to the investigator who ran the test, that DNA matches a known suspect. Not Martin Smart, not Bobidi, someone who, at the time of that announcement, was still alive. Former Sheriff Hagwood has said publicly that he believes several people were involved in the killings, in moving evidence, in taking Tina, and that some of them are alive right now. So here's where the Keddie case rests more than 4 decades on. 3 people were murdered in a room while 3 children slept a few feet away and were spared. 1 child was not spared. She was chosen and taken and carried out of the mountains, and investigators have never been able to say why her and only her. The former sheriff has said he believes there was something about Tina that meant she could not be left behind to be found. So think about what that sentence implies. It implies the killers were not strangers to that house. It implies that at least one person in that cabin, living or dead, could have identified them. And it implies that the answer to this entire case has been walking around, breathing free air for over 40 years. Somewhere tonight, if the investigators are right, there is a person who knows what happened in cabin 28. They know who held the hammer. They know who made that anonymous phone call. They know why a 12-year-old girl was carried into the dark. The cabin itself is gone, demolished years ago, as if tearing down the walls could tear down the memory. But it could not, because a house can be erased, but a question cannot. My name is Jesus Enrique Rosas. I'm the crime coroner. Much love and bliss.